So we are in a new season, season of transition for our students. I don't know if you know this, but our students here on campus have 1 week of class starting tomorrow and 1 week of finals, and that's it. And then it's like, well, then what? That's the big question, because no matter where they are in this whole system, it's time to move on. If they're an upperclassmen, it's time to either look at internships or graduation or gap years or applications or interviews or maybe more school. If they're underclassmen, it is maybe back home for the first time since they've been gone away, or maybe it's transfer, or maybe it's another gap year, whatever it is. That need to move on is almost always filled with anxiety, because we recognize that this next step is uncertain and it's unknown and it's unstable. And yet we realize that's life. So you might not be in school. You might not be in a completely different season in your life, but you know this. You know that almost every season in life we're called to move on. And almost every season where we're called to move on is uncertain and is unknown and is unstable. And that's life, right? But sometimes there's this desire in every one of us that sometimes I want to be settled. I want to be secure. I just want to know, right? That sometimes it's like, okay, what if life was just calm? Like, right? What if it was predictable? What if it was just stable? And yet we realize that we can't have that, because that isn't life. The great news and the bad news is that life keeps on going. That's great, but it's also a problem. And the great news and the bad news is when the time comes, every one of us, we have to move on. And so we have this series for the rest of this semester. It's the reality that every one of us is in a place of life where we have to move on. So it's just called Move On. And this series will go past the semester's ending, because we know this, life keeps going. Even if they have moved on, our students, we invite them at least to listen to this and to realize that God is in that uncertainty, that God is, even in the midst of having to move on, there is something about the unknown, something about being unstable, that we know this, that when it's time to move on, you have to go. That's just the reality. When it's time to move on, you have to move. And I wonder how many of us hate that? Like, right, I wonder how many of us just like, no, I just want life to be certain. I just want to know. I want life to be stable. I want to have control. And then when we don't have control, I think sometimes we can get a little bitter. Like when we don't have control, when things seem just like, this is not how it's supposed to go. I think sometimes we can maybe even turn on God. There's a man, his name is Timothy Keller. Timothy Keller was a Presbyterian pastor. He started Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan in 1989. I think he was 40 years old. He moved there with his wife, Kathy, and their 3 boys. And after a lot of work, Redeemer Presbyterian became kind of this place for young professionals in Manhattan to go, because Timothy Keller just engaged culture in a really, really actually impressive and remarkable way. He was an intellectual person who just wanted to ask the questions and answer the questions that people around him, young people, were asking. And so he gathered a lot of people to his church. He wrote a bunch of books. I think I have every one of his books. I think I've read every single thing he's written. Obviously, we disagree on some things, but I learned a lot from what he had to teach. And one of the things that he taught was how direct he could be when he spoke of like my desire to be certain before I move on. That we have this desire of, okay, God, if you just do things the way I want them to be done, then things will go well. In fact, he has this great quote. He said, most of us actually feel like we know better than God how our life ought to go. And if it's not going right, quote unquote right, we get anxious. We get filled with self-pity, we get scornful, we get skeptical, we get hard and cynical. But actually, he said, patience and the ability not to worry and to not be really upset when things are going wrong in your life is essentially a kind of humility. He says, you want to know why? He says, because it takes humility to say, well, I thought this was how my life ought to go, but I don't know. How do I know? How do I know what God can see? He said, I can't see from the end to the beginning. I can't see from my vantage point my entire life and what's best for me. I don't know. And then he said something so profound. He said, it takes pride to be worried. It takes a lot of pride for us to say, look, God, I know how my life ought to go, and I'm afraid that God's not going to get it right. But humility says, well, I thought that this was what really should be happening, but I don't know. And then he wanted to say, but if you're a Christian, you have enough joyful hope. He said, for the Christian, joy is always on the way. Because the one in charge of us, the one in charge of the whole universe, is our Father. So here's a question. How can we have joyful hope? How can we have faith when it's time to move on and things are still uncertain and things are still unknown and things are still unstable? There's no magic wand and there's no magic word, but I would say this, there are 5 words. There are 5 words that can change your life. You know, last week, Good Friday, I was just praying. I went out after our Good Friday services and I was just walking around campus and through the woods, and I was just praying about what would it be like to have been one of the apostles and one of the disciples on Good Friday and on Holy Saturday. I really just pretended like, what if I didn't know the end of the story? It would just be this unimaginable uncertainty. And you'd have no idea. You have no idea what to do. You have no idea, how do I move on? In fact, okay, Jesus is dead, but not only that, one of you betrayed him. Like one of this close group of friends, another one of you denied him. Almost all of you abandoned him. And imagine, here you are, he's dead, and you're completely unprepared for the next thing. Why? Because everything is wrong. Like, all of this is wrong. You say that this shouldn't have happened. You know, just again, sit in that for a little bit. All of this is wrong. This shouldn't have happened. You'd be so crushed and so uncertain about this unknown and this unstable. And then today's reading, right? And then today's gospel, all of a sudden, in the midst of that uncertainty, in the midst of that what's unknown, in the midst of everything being unstable, Jesus is there. And he's like, peace, and gives you the Holy Spirit. And then what happens? The next week, we heard it in the gospel today, Thomas is there with him. And Jesus speaks those words to Thomas, do not be unbelieving, but believe. And then Thomas falls to the ground, falls to his knees, and he says these 5 words. And these 5 words absolutely change everything. He says, my Lord and my God. Jesus is God. Jesus is God. He not only has risen from the dead, he is the Lord of life. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. And yes, we still have problems. And yes, we still have uncertainty. Yes, we still have the unknown because we still have life. And life still happens. And the next step still needs to be stepped. But all of this is different because those 5 words demonstrate this. They declare that the resurrection is real and that Jesus is God. That's why at the end of John's gospel, we heard it today. He says, listen, these words have been written down so that you may come to believe, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. These words, that Jesus, my Lord and my God, that you may come to believe that Jesus is who he says he is, and that by believing, you might have life in his name. And that life, that's the grace that comes through baptism, that life, that's the joy that comes through this truth. Now, imagine the truth. You can build a life on that. Like you can build a whole life on those 5 words, my Lord and my God. No matter what the next step is, you can move on with confidence. In the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of the unknown, in the midst of when things are unstable, even when things are painful, even when things are problematic, even when there's loss, even when there's disaster, you can live a life of joy because those 5 words are true. Again, even in the midst of loss and even in the midst of disaster. In 2020, Tim Keller had been serving that Manhattan church for years. And in 2020, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He spent the next 3 years, he taught and he preached and he served and he fought cancer that ultimately took his life in May of 2023. But before he died, he said these words about how he could move on knowing these 5 words. And he said this, he said, remember his wife's name's Kathy. And he said, let me just say something that Kathy and I have talked about for the last year. This is this interview he was giving. And he just said these words from his heart. He said, we've been talking about for the last year. being diagnosed with cancer. He said, if Jesus Christ was actually raised from the dead, if he really got up, walked out, and was seen by hundreds of people, talked to them, if he was raised from the dead, then you know what? Everything's going to be all right. Whatever you're worried about right now, whatever you're afraid of, everything is actually going to be okay. Because you got to remember, we're not just talking about resurrected people, we're talking about a resurrected world. Meaning, he said, there's plenty of other religions that talk about an afterlife, which is a non-material world where you get kind of a consolation for the world that was lost. Christianity says that it's not just your bodies that are being resurrected, but the world, the material world, is going to be cleansed of all evil and all suffering and all sin. And if Jesus is raised from the dead and the whole world is going to be, in a sense, resurrected, everything is going to be okay. Everything. You don't know how, and I don't know how, but it will be. If these 5 words are true, Jesus, my Lord and my God, everything is going to be okay. To have the power, to have the faith to be able to move on. Of course, we still have our problems. We still have uncertainty and the unknown, and we still have, why? Because we still have life. Life still happens. That next step still needs to be stepped. But it's different. It's all different because these 5 words are true. They're true. You know, we say this to our students all the time, that the only reason to believe anything is because it's true. The only reason to believe that Jesus is God, that he is my Lord and my God, is because it's actually true. One of my heroes named C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote about this. He wrote about this in his book, Mere Christianity, about the virtue of faith. And he had this big question. He said, before I became a Christian, I never understood how Christians could describe faith as a virtue. Because he said, if something's true, why is it virtuous to believe that? It's not virtuous to believe 2 + 2 is 4. Why would you say faith is a virtue? And then afterwards, after he became Christian, he said, I finally understand why. He said, because when you come to the conclusion that Jesus is who he says he is, that he is my Lord and my God, living that out is not just a matter of my reason, right? I also have my emotions. I also have my feelings. I also have my changing circumstances. He said it like this. He said, a lot of times when people leave the faith, he said, it's not reason that's taking away my faith. On the contrary, my faith is based on reason, right? There's evidence for Jesus rising from the dead. He says, it's my imagination and my emotions. The battle between faith and reason on one side and emotion and imagination on the other. I love this because this is one of the things as our students are being launched into summertime and these new situations and a new life, as they're moving on, one of the things that they'll find is the truth of Jesus, the truth of the Catholic Church, the truth of Christianity is stable. It is certain. It is known. But what's not stable, what's not certain, what's not known is my own heart and the situations I get myself into. And the fact that there are some times when I don't want this to be true. Lewis said it like this. He said, but supposing a man's reason once decides that the weight of evidence is for it, that Jesus really is my Lord and my God. He said, I can tell a man what's going to happen to him in the next few weeks. There will come a moment when there's bad news, or he's in trouble, or he's living among a lot of other people who do not believe it, and all at once, his emotions rise up and carry out a sort of blitz on his belief. Or maybe there will come a moment where he wants a woman, or he wants to tell a lie, or he feels very pleased with himself, or he sees a chance of making a little money in a way that's not totally fair. Some moment, in fact, at which it would be very convenient if Christianity were not true. And once again, his wishes and desires will carry out a blitz. I'm not talking about a moment when there's any real new reasons against Christianity. Those have to be faced, and that's another issue. I'm talking about moments where the mere mood rises up against it. And this is what every one of us face. I imagine Thomas even faced this. Seeing Jesus face to face, saying those 5 words that change everything, my Lord and my God. I'm sure there were times when Thomas was being tortured for his belief. Imagine when Thomas was just hungry and tired and alone because he was sent out to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, where maybe he didn't want Christianity to be true anymore. But in those moments, what did he do? In those moments, he did what every one of us has to do. We stand on the fact as a foundation that Jesus is who he says he is, that he really is our Lord and our God. I would say this. Maybe there are still moments when I don't know how to still walk in faith. Maybe there's some moments when I need 5 other words. As I mentioned earlier in the Mass, today is Divine Mercy Sunday. And if you know anything about Divine Mercy Sunday, that a number of years ago, Jesus appeared to a Polish nun named Sister Faustina Kowalska with a private revelation to her about his mercy, about his heart, about his love for the world, his ability to conquer sin in every one of us. And he had a prayer called the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. We pray that all the time. It's such a great prayer. He also commissioned an image. He asked St. Faustina to commission an image of himself and his divine mercy. And underneath this image of Jesus stepping forwards towards the sinner with lights, blue, white, and red light coming from his side, symbolizing baptism and symbolizing the Eucharist, symbolizing his mercy. Underneath that image are 5 more words. Those are 5 words that we can make a regular part of every single day. And if we make those 5 words part of our heart, then even when our situations have changed, even when our moods have changed, even when I don't want this to be true, I can live my life and build my life. I can move on in faith. And those 5 words are, Jesus, I trust in you. Jesus, I trust in you. My invitation, here's the last thing. Pray this. My invitation is to live this. It's not magic. It's not a mantra. It is a moment of surrender. To be able to say, my Lord and my God, Jesus, I trust in you even in tears. Shortly before Timothy Keller died, he said this. He said, actually, right now, I couldn't possibly be convinced that Jesus was not raised from the dead, either intellectually or existentially. He said, I know it's true. So by the way, Kathy and I, his wife, he said, we cry. He said, we cried a lot last night. Sometimes the reality of the shortness of what we have left here just overwhelms us. And we were weeping together and we were just crying. And then you say, if Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, it's going to be okay. And then you can wipe your tears, but you don't stop crying. It's like salt in the wound that keeps the wound from going bad. We have tears, but we can still move on. We have loss, but we can still move on. Even in the midst of uncertainty and the unknown, and when life feels unstable, we can still move on. We can still say those 5 words, my Lord and my God. We can still say those other 5 words, Jesus, I trust in you. And we can say them unafraid, and say them unwavering, and say them undaunted. We say those 5 words. Now, because now, once again, this is life. And it's time to move on.
You don't have to stay close. As long as you're somewhere out there, that's enough for me. I don't need to hold you near me, don't need promises to keep. Just the thought that you are breathing somewhere in this world I see. Even if I'm not beside you, even if you never know, there's a quiet kind of comfort just in knowing you still glow. I don't need forever, I just need you to exist. You don't have to stay with me, you don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way, you don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're living in a world I'm not alone. I won't chase you through the distance, won't disturb your chosen life. I'll just keep you in my silence, like a star that shines at night. Through the dark and through the blue, I still think of you. You don't have to stay with me, you don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way, you don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're living in a world I'm not alone. I don't need to be your light, I don't need to cross your mind. All I need is just the truth that you're somewhere still alive. You don't have to stay with me, you don't have to feel the same. Just as long as you're still out there, calling softly through my days. You don't have to look my way, you don't have to be my home. It's enough to know you're living in a world I'm